Well, Shabbat Shalom and good morning and welcome back. This morning is a very special morning because this morning we begin the Torah all over again. This is a VBS Torah study for Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning, as always, by my dear teachers and friends, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University, and Rabbi Marc Gellman of Southern Florida and Temple Beth Torah in Melville, New York. And elsewhere. And this morning is the first Shabbat following Simchat Torah. So on Simchas Torah this past week, we rolled the Torah back from the end back to the beginning, and we open Torah again, and we begin our cycle, our journey through the Torah again. And one of the things that we ask ourselves as we open Torah again is, with what eyes shall we read Torah? What knowledge goes into the reading of Torah? And ironically, this morning we heard of a terrible death in the community. The great Rabbi Moshe Tendler, the age of 95, has left us. Rabbi Tendler was a giant in the world of Torah. He was the son-in-law and dear friend and student of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was a very distant relative, I'm told, and one of the great halachic decisors. At the same time, he was a great halachic scholar, a great scholar of Jewish law and tradition. At the same time, he was a professor of biology at Yeshiva University, a PhD from Columbia University in biology, a man who brought both worlds of science and Torah together, and he was the giant of Jewish medical ethics in the 20th century. Marc, you knew Rabbi Tendler.
Yes, I knew him very well. He was my teacher and my friend, and he was the chairman of the Jewish Medical Ethics Committee of the New York Federation, and when he stepped down, he appointed me as his successor. It was one of the great honors of my life, and to study with him and to know him, and to see someone who knew all of Torah and all of Gemara and all the commentaries, and also had a PhD in microbiology and had patented several viruses and genetically altered bacterium he had patented on his own. He was also the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University. For those who are not familiar with what we call the yeshivish world, there's two great worlds that sort of divide Judaism. There's the Hasidic world, which is emotional and incantatory, and it has a kind of, I wouldn't say anti-intellectual nature, but it's more about feelings and your attitude, the attitude of kavana, of directing your heart to God. And that's the one many people know about the Hasidic world. But there's a modern Orthodox world, which is what we really see in Moshe Tendler. He was the pinnacle of it. And in that world, it's very intellectual. And the difference between the two worlds is very practical. In the Hasidic world, children don't go to limudei chol, they don't go to secular schools. But in the modern Orthodox world, yeshiva world, kids do go to secular universities. And once Derek Bach, who was the president of Harvard, was asked, "Do you have a Jewish quota at Harvard?" And he said, "Well, of course we do. If not, we'd have to admit every graduate of Yeshiva University to Harvard." And it was a sort of an awareness of the tremendous intellectual rigor of that institution, and I was drawn to him that way. And he was also, there's another term that many people who listen to us may not know, and that's posek. There are all sorts of rabbis. You're ordained, on your ordination certificate, it says Yora, Yodin, Yodin. You will teach and judge. But the truth is, most rabbis don't make law. There are certain rabbis, I call them juridical rabbis, who are poskim. These are rabbis who make new law. This is what keeps Jewish law alive. It's what keeps Judaism relevant to the moral issues of our world. And to be a posek, you have to be at the very pinnacle of rabbinic excellence. And his father-in-law, Moshe Feinstein, was the last great posek. I think Moshe Tendler was the last posek, there's no one after him who had his scope of learning and the authority that he had when he ruled. And just one thing that he ruled on, which I had some knowledge of from the inside, was in 1968, the Harvard Committee on Brain Death declared that brain death is death. Very significant ruling, because with it, organ transplantation was now possible with the declaring of the patient as being brain dead. So they could be on a heart-lung machine, but you could take vital organs and transplant them. This was at the time when the drug cyclosporin was invented, and which enabled transplant surgery. So the question is, does Jewish law allow such a thing? And Tendler used a citation from the Talmud of a chicken with its head cut off, running around the courtyard and saying, because the rabbis had ruled, that chicken is mate, it's dead. Even though it's running around, it has motion, it's dead. And so he said the same is true for a human body. After you cut off the head, which means the death of the brain, the body is dead, even if there's a heart-lung machine keeping the organs alive, which you can harvest and transplant for the sake of pikuach nefesh and saving a life. Otherwise, you have the issue of speedy burial. He went through all of this and made a brilliant ruling, which brought Judaism into the 20th century at the time. And it was only the political issues with certain political Orthodox parties in Israel that came back to undermine his ruling, which was a terrible blow to him. But his ruling remains an example of how Judaism can speak to the world, and how, although I don't like saying this because I don't like lists and I don't like comparatives of who's best and who's better, I hate that. But he was the best. He was the best I had ever seen. And his death is a great loss to me. And I say Baruch Dayan Emet, praise be the God of justice, and may his soul be welcomed into the Olam Haba among the holy and the righteous. And I know his first stop is going to be Aristotle and Rambam, and they're going to find that with Moshe Tendler, they have a very interesting new partner in the world to come.
It's a lovely image. Thank you. That's beautiful. And the methodology that he pioneers, which is you've got to know the whole world to know Torah. That Torah is not a world unto itself. Torah is a doorway into the whole world. So a man with the kind of deep scientific knowledge and understanding, that's the kind of knowledge one needs to have to really understand what Torah is trying to say to the world. I think that's a methodology which is very, very powerful and very, very difficult, very precious, and very powerful. So thank you for sharing that. So we begin the reading of Torah. So Simchas Torah was this past week, and we celebrated it on Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning, I'm sitting in shul, and what you do that morning is you take out 3 Sifrei Torah, 3 Torah scrolls. And the first one you read the end of Deuteronomy, and the second one you read the beginning of Genesis. So Torah, looks like a line. It looks like a journey from Genesis to Deuteronomy, from Bereshit to Devarim, from the beginning of the world to the end of the journey. But then you roll it back to the beginning. In the shul that I grew up in, we used to mamish roll the thing back. Now we have enough Torahs, we can open up another one, save our wrists. And you go immediately from the end of Deuteronomy back to the beginning of Genesis. And it struck me that juxtaposition is so interesting. The last scene at the end of the book of Devarim, the last scene at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses climbs the mountain all by himself. People are down in the valley, and he climbs the mountain. God shows him the whole promised land, and then reminds him he's not going to go there. He can just see it. And it describes the whole land that he sees. And then he lies down, and it says that he dies al pi Adonai, literally meaning by the word of God. Of course, the Midrash understood it by the mouth of God with a kiss from God. But he dies alone. I mean, this man who has spent 40 years schlepping this people through the desert, this man who was the teacher and the giver of law and the shaper of Jewish conscience, he dies all by himself. What a horrifyingly lonely image of a man who dies all by himself, and there's no marker. The Torah makes a point to say that no one knows where he's buried to this day, which means there's no marker. The only marker to his life is the Torah itself, or the stories we tell. There's no physical marker. There's no monument where he's there. And the powerful loneliness of that moment struck me as I'm reading it. And then we put that Torah away and open to second Torah and begin the reading of the book. And the book begins all over again with the creation of, well, one man who walks in the world alone. But this time God says, Lo tov hayot adam levado, you shouldn't be alone. And God brings a partner to share his life with him. And we begin the whole question of social life, of family life, of community life, of the life of humanity. And the juxtaposition of the two images really struck me this time, from the deep loneliness of death to the powerful sociability or social context in which we live all of human life. Sherre, you had a moment this week, a personal moment, where this was revealed to you because you took your eldest off to college. And having raised this kid, and God knows he's a remarkable kid, but not an easy kid, to send him off, what you said, through the gates of University of Chicago to say goodbye. So take a moment and tell us how that felt and what you learned from that moment.
Well, I just wanted to comment this idea of Adam's alone when he dies, but then we restart the cycle and he's reconnected. And I think our life is a series of moments where we feel entirely alone. And then we cycle back or cycle forward and reconnect. And then we find ourselves alone. And if we begin to start to see those moments that we feel entirely alone as seasons and opportunities to reconnect, we may not feel as alone in them, right? And as you were speaking, yes, I had a very profound week. I took my son off to University of Chicago, and I kept thinking about when we went to the hospital when he was born, we went as 2 and we came back as 3. And we went to Chicago, we went as 3 and we came back as 2. And there was a part of me that felt like this is really a season of aloneness, right? Like I really felt that this kid was on loan from God, like we had done in the Pidyon Ben, like we really had borrowed him for 18 years. And our job was to release him. And there was, while I was with my husband and we were deeply connected, it's still, there's a part of him that is removed from you. And you go on this journey like Moshe through the wilderness. And let me tell you, Emmett was the wilderness. And at the end of it, you're not with him anymore. And it was far more emotional than I could have imagined. And I have a lot more understanding of why parents weep, because whether it's been hard or easy, it's still been the wilderness. And I thought about that a lot with Moses. Like it wasn't always easy with the people of Israel. And yet dying alone was a real sort of braving the next chapter of his life without the people.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what parenting is.
Without the burden
chapter.
And without the joy of it, and without being able to see the fulfillment of the dream.
Yes, it really, I mean, the Torah is such a microcosm or a metaphor, is a better word, for a life well lived.
Right. So one of the questions that you ask as you finish the Torah is Moshe a success or a failure? Not being able to see the fulfillment of the dream, does that qualify as a failure, as it were? And then on the other hand, having the assurance from God that your children will enter the land and will settle there, and being able to glimpse it, is that as much as we can ask for? Is that as much as we can ask for?
And is that define success?
Yes.
Like one of the things I kept saying is, what is the definition of a successful parenting wilderness journey? Is it that you've left nothing on the table and you've gone the distance, and even when you were ready to quit, then you still stuck with it? Is that the Moses definition of success? Or is the success having a glimpse of what's to come and knowing that you've done everything or not enough? And that's okay too. Like I've really spent a lot of time thinking about what is the definition of the human journey. right? As described both in the parenting journey, but I think it could be in any journey, whether it's with a spouse or whether it's with God or any journey.
Right, which is again what we experience, because you finish the story, and the last story is about the death of the man who you've been following for the last 4 books. And then we turn the Torah back and we start the human drama all over again. So you ask the question, and I think it's significant as well that Kohelet, that Ecclesiastes, is the book that we read last Shabbos, the book which says, there's no escaping from the trap of death, and therefore there's nothing that survives death, is something that Rabbi Gellman and I spent a great deal of time talking about last week. And then you roll the book back to the beginning and start all over again with, let's talk about the human condition. Let's talk about the world that we live in. Let's talk about the elements of the human story: gender, freedom, good and evil, the aspiration toward eternity, the aspiration toward immortality.
And what are those seasons of our lives, right? How many times do we start the book anew within our own book, right? How many chapters do we restart in the own book? Not to take the metaphor so, far, but it really is, what if these are all seasons and we're alone and we're together, and then we make another wilderness journey, and then we're alone, then we're together, and another wilderness journey? Obviously, it's got me reflective as I dropped one of my birds off the nest, and I'm waiting for him to flap his wings. He's flapping, he's doing fine.
He's doing just fine. So let's focus on that first chapter of Genesis. It's a remarkable statement. It's a remarkable piece of literature, for one thing. It flows in a very special way. Marc, talk to me about the literary quality of that first chapter.
Right. I learned this from my students at Northwestern, where I taught creative writing, and I taught them modern midrash, and these were brilliant students in a very quirky class. And I asked them, because they had some questions about the creation story. Is it really 7 days? And the image of man and woman, and they had some problems with that. And I said, okay. So here's your assignment. I want you, with all your problems with the creation story, to write your own creation story. And your only task is to do what this does, which is go from nothing to everything in one page. And then all of a sudden, when they tried to do it, they had a renewed appreciation for the brilliant movement. I would say the internal phenomenology of this, to use a complicated term, but what it means is, if you unpeel the onion a little, here's what you see. There's a sequence in this brief and perfect creation epic of, first, there is just creation of things, just creation. Then above that, then that's the rocks and the light and the dividing and the firmament. The next is the creation of something that is created, like the rocks, but also blessed. And that's the living things, the animals. And Peru Revu, be fruitful and multiply, is first given to the birds as a commandment, and the fish. So the second level is something created and blessed. The third level is us. We are created like the rocks. We are created and blessed like the vegetation and like the animal life. But we are uniquely created in the image of God. And so that 3-level, I would call it a cosmogonic sequence of created and blessed and made in the image is the bone. Those are the bones of the creation story. And on those bones are hung this almost elegiac development from one day to the next, which is exactly perfect. And even though so much is left out, there's no discussion of where the angels are created. There's no, the Torah isn't created. There's a lot of stuff left out, but still what was in there is perfect because it's the story of the development of life and its spiritual hierarchy. That's what I would say.
And it's quiet. It's such a quiet story, right? When you open, for example, the mythologies of the ancient Near East, they're all about war. There's the great Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian mythologies. Abraham's bedtime story was a story about the gods go to war against their mother. Mother Tiamat creates the gods. The gods fill the world with noise and commotion. She decides to destroy her kindlech, her children. This is, of course, centuries before Sigmund Freud. The gods come to Marduk, who's their champion. Marduk goes to war against his mother, the mother god against the sun god, S-O-N god. They fight. He's the thunder and lightning god. He takes a lightning bolt, he smashes her, he destroys her, he puts her above, puts her below, and creates a world for the gods. It's this bloody, brutal war. It's a terrific science fiction movie. And then you turn this story, and it doesn't have any sex. It doesn't have any violence. It doesn't have any war. It doesn't have any noise. It's this brilliantly quiet, symphonic building up until you get to the human being at the end, the epitome of creation, and then God knocks off for a day. And the most wonderful, the repetition, the litany that keeps coming back, Vayar Elohim Kitov. He sees that it's good. He sees that it's good. He sees that it's good. Over and over again, God sees that it is good, a world that is good. It is such a remarkable revolution in human consciousness. The world is not this destructive battlefield of forces against each other. The world has goodness in it. It's built in. Metaphysical goodness is built into the world. Being, beauty is built into the world. Sherre, when you read this story, what do you read of this story? That's the part that I love about the story is Vayar Elohim Kitov, because there's some days when I can feel that, and there's some days it's a bit of a stretch. Vayar Elohim Kitov.
Well, and I also love that you said that it's about quiet, because everybody thinks, and God spoke and the world came into being. But before that, it's that God breathed the world into being. There was a breath, and breath you can't hear, right? Unless you're like, right? It's like a very quiet, and throughout the Bible, we see examples of a still small voice, right? This quiet entry of God. And yet the opening story, which should have like every opening movie with the drama, the sex, the warfare, to grab your attention, is not that. It's quiet.
Very quiet.
I just kept thinking about the rhythms that I see, because Marc mentioned the 3 rhythms he sees. I see what Yitz Greenberg described as the 3 movements. The first is that the world is moving from chaos to order. The second one is that the world is moving from non-life to life. And the third one is moving from sort of less like God to more like God, which is another way of stating what Marc said, but in a different way, is that there is this moving that didn't exist before. And all 3 of them are refinement. And to what degree are we continuing that refinement? And how are we contributed to moving forward, or maybe not? So I think that's an interesting play on the rhythms and the movements of the creation story.
But you're put in the world and to be in the image of the Creator. And you're given dominion over the world. You control the world. God says, here are the keys. Take care of my world. And in the second story, it's even more explicit. In the second story, he brings the man into the garden. And then the Torah adds 2 words, just brilliant. Le'avda u'le'shamra. Le'shamra u'le'avda. You're here to protect the world and to cultivate it. I mean, yes, it's God's world, but here's a rake, and here's a box of garbage bags, and garbage day is Thursday, and you're going to clean it up. Your job is to protect the world, to cultivate the world, to take care of it. You are its caretaker, which is just a wonderful role. I mean, if you ever wondered why you're in the world, that's why God put us into the world, to be the caretakers of creation. So the kids in school came to me one year. The kids came to me after lunch one day and said, Rabbi, I got a question. It's great when kids ask questions. Is recycling a mitzvah? Because they have a big recycling can in the lunch area. I say, absolutely, it's a mitzvah. They said, great, what's the mitzvah? I said, well, taking care of the earth. He said, there must be a bracha. If it's a mitzvah, there must be a bracha. So we had to look for a bracha. So I wrote a bracha. You're not allowed to write brachas, but I'm in California, I can get away with this, right? So it's Baruch Asher Kitshanu Mitzvotav Tzivanu. Blessed is God who's commanded us, Lishmor et Hagan, to protect the garden. That's the bracha. So that becomes our bracha for cultivating and protecting the world. Marc, when you read that story, what do you read in that story? What grabs you in that story?
Well, first of all, it's intentionally quiet. It's not just quiet, but there are loan words from the Enuma Elish in our biblical creation story, which indicate that the author or God intended this to be a transition from the world of many gods fighting into a world of a single unitary principle. And Einstein understood in his work as that this was part of what connected him to being Jewish, that he was always taught that there was a single principle in the world, and that was God. Never more than one God, never fighting gods, never warring gods. And that he looked at Hinduism and said, you can't develop science in that kind of environment because everything has its own God. And there's no concept of a single unitary principle. But there is in Judaism, and there is in his understanding of the unity principle that he spent his whole life looking for. So the word tahom, Ruach Elohim mirachefet al panei tahom, the spirit of God, this breath of God that Sherre beautifully described, it was fluttering like a bird. Mirachefet is like a bird flapping its wings, fluttering on the face of the deep. And the deep is called tahom. It's only used there. It's a hapax legomena, only used once and only used there. And it's intended to be a loan word from the Babylonian Tiamat, tahom, Tiamat, just like later Marduk is Mordecai. So there's a lot of Babylonian loan words. Interestingly, there's no Egyptian loan words except possibly for Moshe, his name in the Torah. But so that silence and that sense of transcending a world that is constantly bifurcated into different powers, so that you're always afraid that you're offending some power or not offending the other one, or are you really praying to the right God? It's all gone. Now there's a single God, a single principle. But to me, the biggest breakthrough is not that. That was the historical great breakthrough, and you're right to point that out. To me, the great breakthrough was the attitude toward women. That for the first time in all of history, all of human history, you have a creation account in which men and women are created equally. Zachar unkeva baraotam. That's the story in chapter 1. And because they lived in a patriarchal society, they had to go back on that brilliant chapter 1 promise of equality into chapter 2, where the quote you made is from chapter 2. It's not good for man to be alone. And then they develop a derivative woman of Eve, who has a name, and she's derivative from his rib. It's quite clear what that's all about. She's not as important as he is, not as holy as he is. He's made by God, and she's made from him. Chapter 1 gives women a foundation text to assert their equality, not because someone in our political world thinks that's right, but because Judaism thinks it's right. And because that kernel of truth, that our daughters should have the same spiritual horizons as our sons, that immense truth took millennia to develop. And when you think this story is maybe 4,000 years old, maybe 5,000 years old, And I was ordained with the first woman in 1972. So that's a long period of time for a promise to be fulfilled. And yet it's there. And someday we'll talk about the legends of chapter 1 and chapter 2 on the image of women, because the rabbis saw this clearly. And they couldn't figure out why are men and women created equally in chapter 1, but in chapter 2, a woman's created derivatively from his rib. So they said, well, it was really two women. The woman in chapter 1 was a woman named Lilith, and the woman in chapter 2 was, of course, named in the Torah as Eve, Chava, the mother of all living. And this transition from an equal woman, an equal partner, to a helper, a helpmeet, someone who just keeps the man from feeling lonely. What about her? What about her loneliness? What about her feelings? It just, to me, it's one of the great revolutions. Here in one chapter, chapter 1, you have the unity principle, which enables science to occur, which enables philosophy to occur, which enables us to look for single causes in the world, all of that. And secondly, we have the promise. It took millennia to fulfill and still isn't fulfilled, that women are equally holy to men.
Marc, thank you. That was wonderful. Sherre, when you read the story, what do you find there?
Well, I'm always so conflicted because the first story is, to me, equality, independence, the archetype of what every woman now strives or hopes to become. And the second story is what she's the embodiment of taking everything down. And that's what sort of the evolution of what a woman is in history. And we're trying to go from chapter 2 to chapter 1 in our lives. So I always want to be like, don't read chapter 2, skip chapter 2. Like there's a part of me that's always like, and also I'm conflicted because I think the way that women have been raised for so long was be a chapter 2, not a chapter 1. Then you'll be attractive to men. Then you'll be the right kind of woman. And now as women are saying, well, I don't really fit chapter 1 or 2. I just want to be me. It really is like shaking up the system. And we hear people saying, I hear all the time women come to me that are single and be like, if I was more subservient, I'd be married. If I was this, if I was that, like there's some narrative that's deeply rooted from chapter 2 in our cultural zeitgeist that we're not enough. And I wonder what the world would have been like had there been no chapter 2, just chapter 1.
I mean, or put it the other way around. You have 10,000 years of chapter 2 history. 10,000 years of subservience, female subservience to men, and now 2.5, 3 generations of women who have tried to reclaim their voices. And we still haven't got there. We're still learning how to reorganize a society, how to reorganize our consciousness, how to reorganize our expression, to try to take, to really understand what it means to be chapter 1, to really be equal, or to really.
I don't even think we're
acknowledge our humanity.
Right, you would ask me 25 years ago, I would have been like, you just have to be strong enough and in the world and it's going to come together and this is the generation. And now 25 years later, I realize it's so deeply embedded into thousands of years of history that it isn't going to take 1 or 2 generations. It's going to take many, many, many years.
Right. I see. But chapter 2, I'm going to speak for chapter 2 if I can for a moment.
Please.
Because I think one of the sexism of it is acknowledged, of course. But what's also sort of clear there is that it's also about our brokenness. I mean, you start out with man being created from the dust of the earth. What am I? I'm schmutz. I'm walking schmutz. I am Adam, and I come from the Adama, from the earth. And the only thing that keeps me from being walking schmutz, from going back to being schmutz, is nishmat Elohim, the nishmat Adonai, the breath, the life breath of God that is inside of me, right? But then this is the same chapter This is the same chapter where there's a tree in the middle of the garden. It's a tree of knowledge. And she takes the tree. She takes the fruit. She takes the fruit because it offers her everything that a human being wants. Wisdom, it's powerful, it's wise, it offers her maturity, and she gives it to him, and he doesn't know, he just eats it. And when God shows up, they run away, and God says to him, did you eat of the fruit? And man is a wuss. He says, no, the girl, she's a woman, she gave it to me. I mean, it's really a story of human brokenness. It's really a story of human brokenness.
There's so much to that story that's so upsetting. I mean, just
the
God
insufficiency,
asking him.
the insufficiency of human being, right?
Right. The fact that God asked him in itself is like where it all begins to go. There's so many levels of which it goes wrong, but God knew exactly what happened. What's he asking him, and what's he lying in front of him?
But you want him to stand up, and you want him to say, damn right I ate from the fruit. You put a fruit in the middle of the garden that offers me knowledge, and you think I'm not going to take that fruit? You're damn right I took the fruit, right? But no. He blames, and she blames the snake, and they all get punished. And then what happens at the end is that there's a separation. This is the explosion that destroys the unity that Rabbi Gellman spoke about. Because now human beings and nature are at odds with each other. Men and women can't talk to each other, can't communicate with each other, and humanity and God are alienated from each other. And this is where death comes into the story, because now death, and that's what we ended up with in the end of Deuteronomy. Death is this terribly lonely place, this terribly lonely experience, the most lonely moment of human existence. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even worse than that, because there's an actual statement in the curse of Eve.
Yes.
That she'll have pain in childbearing,
Yeah.
Okay, but
which is separation.
Pain in childbearing, there's nothing, even Lamaze doesn't fix that, as I learned from our time, where Betty said, stop with your breathing, get out of here, you did this to me.
Yeah, get me the epidural, right?
Exactly. But the curse ends, your desire shall be for your husband, v'hu yimshal, and he shall rule over you.
Yes.
There is no way I can hear God's words in that phrase. However, since I'm the one who gave the speech and I believe it with all my heart, and it's the reason I'm not Orthodox, that our daughter should have the same horizons as our sons. There is something natural and healthy about chapter 2, or I would say at least inevitable. And that is the transition between an equal woman, which is a single woman without children, equal to a man, and then a woman who is a mother. This is a transition which is a natural biological transition, and it has spiritual consequences. And the Torah, because it's a patriarchal society, they couldn't figure out how a woman could transition from being an equal single woman to a mother who obviously was dependent upon the husband to bring in sustenance, and it couldn't figure out about that transition. No?
I think that's just an apologetic, Mark, like a big fat apologetic. I mean, that's a rereading from a backwards lens. Of course, the transition, she was the mother, and you know what? The story would have read better, which is really true to life, which is in chapter 1, she was created equal to him. She became a mother, and he became very jealous of the kid. That's like the more actual story.
Yes. No, that's part of it. No, this is about men trying to adjust to this. They fall in love with a single woman who has different allures. And then they wake up after the woman has a baby and it's a mother. And it's a transition for the man to figure out, wait, how do I love a woman who's now focused on a child and not?
But the story could have said, and then she became more powerful.
And then God told them. God whispered the truth into his ear.
I won't buy that one. Mark,
sorry,
no go.
World.
It's fine.
No
It's fine. It's
The
fine.
real world.
I do, but to take it,
burdens on women that are undeniable, and that's just. That is
Really,
a
I didn't know
natural.
that.
And that I think is, that's how I read that end of the story. The end of the story to me are not curses. These are statements of the realities of the human condition that
Yes.
haunt us, that haunt
Yeah,
us.
you have
Sherre,
to read it
you
that way.
spoke about it. It's not childbirth. It's a whole lifetime of separation that's so painful. And, you know, and it talks about the man's burden of making a living, which is every man's haunting, the ghost, that the demon that haunts guys, you know. And now as women become our equals in the society, it haunts women as well. And then for all of them, the most haunting thing of all is where we ended with Deuteronomy, is the haunting specter of death, and what that means and what that does to the human consciousness, what that does
And
to
being
the human,
entirely alone.
and being alone, right? And how do you hold on to each other and hold on to the eternity of a family and the eternity of a community in the face of that terrible tragedy? So this morning, we've begun our exploration of the most wonderful stories of what it means to be a human being and how we live in the world as human beings. And that's really what the beginning of Genesis is. So for all of our friends, take out the Chumash and read the Parsha. And read those first 2 chapters. And if you have somebody around who you can read it with and have this kind of an argument, that is one of the great joys of life. That's one of the solutions to human loneliness, is to have a chavrusa, a chaver, chavera, someone you can learn with and learn from a completely different perspective and understand different ways of seeing the most powerful questions, ask different ways of asking and addressing the most powerful questions of the human condition. Let me wish you a good Shabbos. Thank you to Rabbi Hirsch. Thank you to Rabbi Gellman. Welcome back to another year of Torah study at VBS. And I'm so glad we can do this. We will be coming back in person someday as soon as they install the video equipment in the new chapel. We'll be
Which
talking.
is beautiful, by the way.
It's beautiful, and we'll have a nice celebration, and we'll bring Rabbi Gellman on the screen so he can be with us. But in the meantime, let me wish you all a very, very good Shabbos and a very beginning of a wonderful year. We'll be davening in just a few minutes. 10 o'clock, we begin our service here on Facebook and on YouTube. And during the course of the week, you'll be hearing about all of the activities and classes and opportunities to learn here at VBS through the American Jewish University, where Sherre is, and the wonderful writing that Rabbi Gellman's offering us. To everyone watching, I have a very good Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.